All right. Well, good afternoon. My name is David Parks, and together with Francesca Dominici, I'm one of the faculty co-directors of the Harvard Data Science Initiative. Delighted to see that there are so many of you here today for the second Harvard Data Science Initiative 5th anniversary keynote given by Megan Stevenson. Megan's talk is part of a series of special events we are hosting this year to mark the HDSI's anniversary. Throughout the coming months, we will convene seminars, tutorials, workshops, and panels, some of which will be in person and some of which will be online, that showcase the work of leading computer scientists, statisticians, domain experts from law, from business, from public policy, education, medicine, health. Megan Stevenson's work exemplifies the exciting potential of scholarship that lies at the intersection of methodology and application, and we are grateful that she's agreed to join us this afternoon. This talk also reflects an emphasis we have placed at the Harvard Data Science Initiative on the role that data science can play both in shining light on inequity in society, as well as improving society. Megan is an economist and a criminal justice scholar at the University of Virginia, where she is both Associate Professor of Law and Associate Professor of Economics. She also holds a PhD in Agricultural and Resource Economics from UC Berkeley. She has conducted empirical research in various areas of criminal justice reform, including bail, algorithmic risk assessment, and juvenile justice. She publishes in both law reviews and economic journals. In recent years, Megan has been doing work at the intersection between data analytics and criminal justice. And in today's talk, she will discuss her path-breaking work that has studied the role of algorithmic risk assessments as an aid to judges in Virginia in sentencing. The paper this relates to is titled, as you see, Algorithmic Risk Assessment in the Hands of Humans. Megan would like to thank you for being here today. Over to you.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to speaking with all of you, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments when we get to that part of the talk. So today, I'm primarily going to be talking about a paper called Algorithmic Risk Assessment in the Hands of Humans. And this is a paper that I've co-authored with Jennifer Doliak. Risk assessments are statistical tools that predict who will commit crime in the future. They're used, for instance, to help determine bail after someone is arrested. They're used to help determine whether someone will be released on parole, and they're used in sentencing. The main idea behind risk assessment tools is that they help identify people at high risk of committing crime in the future and lock them up in order to prevent that crime. Sometimes this is phrased in the opposite direction. That risk assessments are for identifying people at low risk of committing crime and recommending them for release, leaving those at higher risk incarcerated. Now, either way you phrase it, the premise of risk assessment adoption is that the incarceration decision should be based, at least in part, on hypothetical crimes that people might commit in the future. So we should let that sit in. So this is 2021, this is theoretically the land of liberty, and we put people in concrete cages based on speculation about what they might do in the future. This is something that should give people pause. This is a very powerful and disturbing type of decision, and that if we're going to do it, it's something that we should do very carefully. Now, this is something that has been going on in criminal justice decision-making since way before risk assessments were adopted, however. Predicating incarceration on the basis of speculated future crime has been a part of decision-making in the criminal legal system for centuries. Now, given this history, some people argue that using an algorithm to make predictions about future crime is not fundamentally all that different from using human intuition to make predictions about future crime. I mean, if we're going to do this at all, if we're going to lock people up based on a prediction, we should be as confident as we possibly can be about these predictions. We should use the most accurate methods possible. And there are lots of reasons to believe that risk assessments are more accurate than human beings. There's a long literature making this argument, and algorithms have performed humans in many different tasks. Policy simulations have suggested that there can be very large gains from adopting algorithms. And we can lower incarceration rates by 40% without increasing crime. That we can lower crime by 25% without increasing incarceration, simply by making the carceral decision on the basis of the algorithm instead of the judge. This, however, is not uncontroversial. Risk assessments don't have race as an explicit input, but the data that's used to generate them is a byproduct of a racially biased world. Many risk assessments include explicit socioeconomic markers, such as employment status, housing status, marital status, even zip code as predictors. All risk assessments include the criminal record as an input. And the criminal record may partially reflect actual criminal activity, but it also reflects policy choices, such as broken windows policing and the war on drugs. It reflects numerous discretionary choices about who to arrest, who to charge, who to convict, and how much. And these discretionary decisions are inevitably affected by stereotypes, particularly stereotypes about Black and brown criminality. At this point, it's pretty uncontroversial to say that risk assessments are racially biased. But again, so are judges. We live in a world where predictions about the future are already being made. They may not be explicitly formalized in an algorithm, but the human beings engaged in this predictive process are also considering socioeconomic factors. They're also considering the criminal record. And in addition, they may be considering factors such as whether the defendant says, yeah, instead of yes, sir. They may be considering the clothes he's wearing, the accent he has, the color of his skin. In this world, in the real world, the racially biased algorithm might be the better of two not great alternatives. So what I've said so far is part of a pretty standard dialogue about risk assessment over the last 5 or 6 years. The question is often framed as a question of algorithm versus judge. But in practice, algorithms are virtually never used to entirely replace judicial discretion. Risk assessment tools are provided to judges as an input in their decision-making process. Judges have the discretion to follow the recommendations associated with the algorithm or not, which changes the story a little bit. It's not a question of man versus machine, but a question of how the algorithm affects the decision-making process of the human being. And that's primarily what I'm going to talk to you today about. The main focus of my talk today is on this paper I mentioned previously. It looks at what happened when risk assessment for use at sentencing was adopted in the state of Virginia. And our paper explores two central areas. The first thing we look at is kind of descriptive. How do judges use risk assessments? Are they hugely influential, totally dominating their decision? Do people defer to the algorithm? Or do they ignore them? Do they not pay attention to them at all? Or in a sort of more nuanced way, do they pay attention to them for some types of people in some situations and not for others? That's one kind of set of questions we're going to explore. The other set of questions is kind of more practical. How does risk assessment use affect the outcomes that we care about relative to the status quo? So when I say the status quo, I mean decision-making without algorithms, how judges were making decisions before that. Do they do the things that people hope they would do? Do they lower incarceration rates? Do they lower crime? Do they do the things that people were afraid they would do? Do they increase racial disparities? Do they lower racial disparities? Do they have any effect at all? So that's the second part of our question. And although today I'm primarily going to be talking about this paper, looking at risk assessment and use, and also to some extent touching briefly on risk assessment use in other places and settings from other research projects that I or others have done. At the end of the talk, I want to also kind of turn to different avenues in which data science can have a potential role in more criminal justice reform. As you may have noted from my previous remarks, I don't think risk assessment is going to play a central role in the type of fundamental change that I believe our criminal legal system is in need of. But I do think that data science has an important role to play. And so I'm going to just discuss a few different avenues for you to think about in terms of different ways that that role could manifest. All right, so let's get started with this paper. So the empirical setting of our paper is in Virginia, and Virginia was an early adopter of risk assessment. They started using risk assessment in the sentencing decision in the early 2000s. They adopted it solely for people convicted of drug, larceny, or fraud offenses. They call it the nonviolent risk assessment. So it was designed for a certain group of defendants, those that were convicted of nonviolent offenses. And at least in the sample I'm going to be working on today, there's no risk assessment for anybody convicted of any other offenses. So risk assessments in Virginia are built with logistic regressions. The predictive factors include criminal history. It includes basic demographic factors such as your gender and your age. Age is heavily weighted in this score. And they include some socioeconomic factors such as your marital status and your employment status. So the regression coefficients from the logistic regression are then converted into integer weights and summed to give a risk score. So in the process of determining sentencing, a prosecutor or a probation officer will fill out this check sheet, giving a certain number of points for each characteristic that a person has. The more points they have, the higher their risk level is, the higher their risk score is. Now I should pause and say that this method of developing and using risk assessments is very common. So among jurisdictions that use risk assessments in the United States, of which there are tons, risk assessment is very, very widely used in a variety of areas of criminal justice decision-making. They tend to follow this basic format. Now in research, I know researchers are focusing a lot more on kind of more complicated algorithms. Some people are working on trying to de-bias algorithms. These are not currently in use. Currently, it's still a fairly simple formula. And in Virginia, risk assessment was adopted with a specific goal in mind. It wasn't just here, I'm going to give judges more information, you go ahead and do with it what you want. No, risk assessment was adopted to decrease sentences. And there's a little historical story behind this. So in the mid-90s, Virginia adopted this Truth in Sentencing Reform Act, which abolished parole. The legislature was concerned that prisons were going to become massively overcrowded because now people had to serve the entirety of their sentence. Their solution was to adopt this nonviolent risk assessment as a release valve, a way of diverting the lowest risk nonviolent offenders from jail or prison. And the goal was to identify the 25% lowest risk and divert them. So as I said previously, judges have the ultimate say about what the sentence is. The risk assessment is provided to the judge. They get both the raw score and a kind of an indicator for whether or not the score comes with a recommendation for diversion, whether the score is low enough for this recommendation, but judges have the final say. They can choose to follow that diversion recommendation or not. The data I'm using in this project comes from the Virginia Criminal Sentencing Commission, which is a very rich data set, captures data on all people convicted of a felony from 1995 till current. They provided all the risk scores as well as the information, the predictors used to calculate the risk scores and a variety of other case details. I supplement this data from data that comes straight from the Virginia courts. This is web scraped and matched. And this data provides a few crucial things that the Sentencing Commission data didn't have, such as race and gender. All right, so let's just dive in and look at some of our results here. So the first question that we wanted to address is, do judges pay attention to the risk scores? Do they influence the sentence that they're going to give? And we're going to try and answer this question in two different ways. So one of the ways is looking at, do they pay attention to the diversion recommendation that's associated with the risk score? Now, once again, the diversion recommendation is something that's received by the 25% lowest risk individuals. There's a threshold, there's a cutoff in this risk score. Everyone who scores above this cutoff does not get the diversion recommendation. Everyone who scores below it do. So what we're going to do is, in technical terms, it's regression discontinuity with risk score as the running variable. Effectively, what we're going to do is we're going to say, let's look at people right below this cutoff and right above, and let's see if they get substantially different sentences. If they do, we can infer that this is because the judges are responding to this diversion recommendation. So the second thing we're going to do here is we're going to look and see if the correlation between the predicted risk score and sentencing increases after risk assessment was adopted. So here we're going to use an event study design, and we're just going to see whether that correlation increases, and importantly, whether the timing of that increase is coincident with risk assessment adoption, which would help support an inference that this is due to risk assessment use. All right, so let's show some results. So here I've got two graphs. On the left-hand side, we're looking at the probability of incarceration for people with various risk scores. So this risk score is down here on the horizontal axis. It's normalized so that 0 is the threshold. Basically, everybody who has a positive score fails to get the diversion recommendation. Everyone who has a negative score does get the diversion recommendation. And each dot is sort of the average fraction of being incarcerated for those with 3 risk scores. Over here, we have, it's very similar, except that on the vertical axis, we have the months of incarceration, which has been through, which I've transformed with an inverse hyperbolic sign transformation, basically to reduce the influence of extreme outliers. And what we see is that defendants right above the cutoff are about 6 percentage points more likely to be incarcerated and receive sentences that are about 23% longer. So this first piece of evidence suggests that judges do respond to this diversion recommendation. Although one could argue maybe they're responding in a way that's non-ideal. I mean, people right above and right below this threshold are very similar, and yet are receiving different sentences. But the kind of nudge that's associated with risk assessment use, this nudge that people below the cutoff should be diverted and those above should not, seems to be influential. Now, moving on to the second chart. So this second chart shows the correlation between the predicted risk score before risk assessment is adopted. So that's these 3 dots over here culminating in the one centered on this red dotted line, versus after risk assessment is adopted. And each dot kind of shows the change relative to the year before it was adopted. And you can see the correlation between the risk score and sentencing is fairly constant in the years before risk assessment's used. And then after it gets adopted, there's an immediate spike in the correlation, suggesting that judges are sentencing in a way that's more correlated with this risk score than they had previously. Now, let me pause for a second and say, judges were already sentencing, the sentencing already correlated with the risk score. Judges are already taking some of these factors into account, as you would expect they would if they were making their own kind of subjective, intuitive assessments of someone's risk. But there does seem to be this increase in the extent to which these factors are taken into account after they have this tool in their hands. Now, I don't want to claim that, I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that that this tool completely dominated their decision making and that they're strictly following it. That's not at all true. It's influential, but it's not massively influential. And as we'll explore as we get later onto this talk, this is because some judges use it a little bit more than others, and also they use it, they seem to respond to it a little bit more for certain types of people than for other types of people. All right, so let's move on. So the next question is, what's the net effect that risk assessment had on incarceration levels? So previously I told you, that they used it, but we don't know what that means. Like, it was supposed to reduce incarceration. That was the design, that was the goal. Did we achieve that goal? Or did they use it in some other way? In order to do this, I'm going to be using a difference in differences research design. So I'm comparing before and after risk assessment is adopted across eligible and ineligible cases. So remember, the only people eligible for risk assessment is those convicted of these nonviolent offenses. And what the difference in differences design does is it kind of allows you to, I guess, effectively control for certain time trends that would be expected to affect risk assessment eligible and ineligible defendants similarly. The best way I can kind of say it quickly. So let's pause before we go into this, and let's talk about some potential challenges to this research design. So, we're kind of looking at this, this before and after comparison, arguing, that by including this ineligible group that we're soaking up any other time trends. But one concern is there might have been some other policy that happened around the same time that could complicate our interpretations. So we're like, I don't know if this is these changes or lack of changes are due to the risk assessment or to this other policy change, this other law change. Now, most of the time, when you're a researcher, you spend a time frantically Googling, is there something I have to worry about? Is there a confounder here? Now, in this case, I reached out to the Sentencing Commission to ask them this question, and they literally sent me like a multi-page Excel spreadsheet documenting in fine detail every single change to sentencing law and policy that has occurred over the last 25 years. So I can say with a little bit more confidence than many people can that there's really no other changes that happened around that time that was likely to influence outcomes. Now, another set of concerns you might have is that risk assessment adoption might have led to a change in plea bargaining practices or arrest practices, where maybe they fail, they fail to, they're less likely to arrest nonviolent offenders because they think, they're not even going to get locked up anyway, or some other story like that. So all of these stories would suggest that there is a change in either the frequency of cases or characteristics of cases. And so we do a variety of careful tests to make sure that both the frequency and the distribution of case characteristics looks pretty similar before and after risk assessment is adopted, which helps us to be able to, kind of make this causal argument that this is whatever we see is the result of risk assessment use and not some other change. All right, so diving in. We don't see any net change in sentencing for these nonviolent offenders. It was adopted explicitly to lower incarceration rates. I mean, they designed it as a kind of one-way ratchet. This is, if you score below this, you were diverted. If you score above it, well, just business as usual. Now, we saw that judges used it, but effectively they used it to the extent that they increased releases for those in the lower risk category. They decreased them for those in the higher risk category. There was basically like a reshuffling of who was incarcerated, so that the jail beds were increasingly allocated to those with higher risk scores, but the number of people locked up effectively remained the same. All right, so this wasn't what the legislature had intended with its adoption, but it's still consistent, at least with one argument about ways that risk assessment could be effective. So that we have this reshuffling of jail beds. Maybe what we could see is a decrease in crime. That's kind of like one of the goals, right? So now the ideal is that we're now going to prevent crime because the people that would have committed it are locked up and are therefore incapacitated, prevented from committing that crime. So we're going to do something similar to what we did previously. So we're still doing the difference in differences approach, but now we're going to look at recidivism as the outcome. And recidivism is defined here as the likelihood of having a new felony conviction within 3 years of your sentence date. No decline in recidivism. So risk assessment use kind of didn't, even though we reshuffled jail beds in a way that would make you think, that crime would go down, we don't see any evidence of a decline. And if anything, arguably a small potential increase in recidivism. Not statistically significant, but that's the direction that it goes. All right. So by the way, I'm gonna unpack this a little bit. We're gonna keep talking about this, but I want to show you one more of what I consider kind of the main results of the paper, which is the impact that risk assessment had on racial disparities in sentencing. So we're going to do something called a triple differences research design. We're still looking across that pre-post, comparing any pre-post changes for the eligible group to pre-post changes for the ineligible group. And now we're going to take all of this package and then we're going to see if that was different for Black defendants versus white defendants. All right. So before I go into some results, let's just talk a little bit about racial disparities in the risk assessment and what we might expect could happen to racial disparities in sentencing as a result of its use. So this graph shows, plots the guidelines recommended sentence in months. So I haven't mentioned this yet, but even before risk assessment was adopted, Virginia uses this system of recommending sentences based on a variety of factors, severity of the offense, some criminal record stuff. And this is just the guidelines recommended sentence in months. It doesn't take into account anything the risk assessment has. On this vertical axis right here, we're showing the fraction of people that were rated as low risk according to this risk assessment. Now, again, these are the people whose score was low enough that they get their recommendation for diversion from jail or prison. On the top, we see the fraction of people of low risk white defendants. And on the bottom, we see the fraction of Black defendants with this low risk ranking. And you can see across the range of the guidelines recommended sentence, white defendants are substantially more likely to get this low risk designation than Black defendants. And we've kind of disentangled that a little bit to see where these disparities are coming from. Part of it comes from disparities in the criminal record. Part of it comes from disparities in the socioeconomic factors I mentioned previously, such as the employment rates and marital status. But that is what it is. So we've got this risk score, which, as we probably not terribly shocking, is racially disparate. Does sort of disproportionately recommend white defendants for release relative to Black defendants, even on top of the information already provided in the kind of the nudges or the encouragement already provided by the guidelines recommended sentence. Now let's turn to the question: does this mean that risk assessments will increase racial disparities in sentencing, or that we should expect it to? And I want to pause for a sec because I think this is a little complicated. I think like the first instinct is to say, yes, there's a lot of disparities in this risk assessment. The most likely outcome is that it will increase racial disparities. But remember, judges are already sentencing in a racially disparate manner. And so the question is, how does this information affect that decision? I want to point to another literature, that you may or may not be familiar with, but there was a couple of papers that came out a few years ago that evaluated the impact of ban the box. So the box is a box on a job application that you're supposed to check off if you have a felony conviction. And so the ban the box movement says, let's get rid of this on job applications because it disadvantages people and it can support racial disparities. Just because of racial disparities in conviction now translate into racial disparities in who gets the job. Now, what the papers that looked at this a few years ago found was that it worked the opposite direction. By removing this information, you actually increased racial disparities in who got kind of interviews, who got reached out to for the job. And the logic is this: in the absence of information, what employers were doing was they were engaging in statistical discrimination. They were leaning on race as a proxy for, does this person have a criminal record? And therefore not making, not basically calling back individuals of a certain race. Now, in this setting, kind of we're experiencing, like, this is like the opposite phenomena. Risk assessments give increased information. On average, this information is kind of not, you wouldn't think of it as being advantageous for Black defendants. But if judges were engaging in statistical discrimination beforehand, this increased information could serve to kind of, instead of leaning on race as the proxy for things that they care about, they have more finely detailed information. Racial disparities could decrease. So that was a bit of a diversion, but I think it's important to like really think through the mechanisms involved when you think about what the impacts are expected to be on the ground. Of course, that's not to say that either of these, as I set out, are we still might be very, very far from what we want in terms of justice and a criminal legal system that we feel good about. But in terms of which is going to be worse, judicial discretion, judicial decision making without the algorithm or with, there's a lot of complicated factors. That being said, so let's just look at the results. The net effect is null on sentencing. So we find no evidence that risk assessment led to either an increase in racial disparities or a decrease. All right. So let's move on. Oh, I am going to come back with a little bit more information about this towards the end. So the second kind of phase of the paper is looking at why did we not see the gains? So some people really were very bullish about the use of risk assessment. There's been a lot of hope that this would bring about a lot of good in practice. And by and large, that hasn't panned out. So it hasn't panned out in Virginia. It hasn't panned out in Kentucky. There's a few other scholars that have looked at it in other jurisdictions, and there has not yet been the kind of big payoffs that people hoped from adopting these algorithms. But I'm focusing here in Virginia, so let's talk a little bit about potential reasons why the big payoffs didn't occur. So the first question is maybe it was just a bad risk tool. Maybe it just was poorly designed. It wasn't that accurate. We wouldn't expect much from it. I don't think that that's what's going on. So we built our own risk assessment tool. We really tried to optimize it as much as we could. We basically put all the data that we could muster on it. We used an algorithm that allowed us to take advantage of nonlinearities and interactions across different inputs. And we found that it actually performs very similar to the one in Virginia. Now I'll say that neither of these are overwhelmingly accurate. I think predicting crime is just difficult. And so that's something to keep in mind in the back of your head. A second thought could, this one has to do with use. Maybe it was just slow uptake. So we're evaluating during the first 2 years of its use. Maybe like any new technology, it takes a little while. It takes experience, time to develop experience, and familiarity with the tool to know when to follow it, when not to follow it. And again, no, that does not seem to be likely to be explaining the problem. So judges actually use risk assessment the most during the first 2 years after adoption. And then over time, they seem to consult it less. So there's sort of like a desistance in use over time, which is again, something that has been documented in other jurisdictions as well. Maybe impact was diluted by non-users. So there's been some great survey evidence about how judges think about risk assessment. And there's a wide variety of opinions. Some of them wholeheartedly embrace it. Others are very skeptical and they say, I don't use risk assessment. I also don't go to psychics. And so, one of the kind of subset analyses that we do is we try to dive in and try to identify the groups of judges that appear to be using risk assessment the most, to appear to be responding to it the most, and look at impacts using those judges. And again, we find even when focusing on this subgroup of judges that appear to use risk assessment most, there are still no gains. We do, however, find that racial disparities increased after risk assessment adoption for this subset of heavy users. Now, I think it's a little hard to interpret this result. Was it because of heavy use that racial disparities increased? I think that's one way you could interpret the data, that heavier use would have used to the increase in racial disparities that people are rightfully very concerned about. But these judges may also be different across other dimensions. And so I think we should think of this as a red flag on an important issue. All right, so one of the theories, so if has to do with poor use of information. So risk assessment tools, the idea is we'll give people more information. We'll give them improved predictions about who's going to commit crime in the future. But if we don't know what to do with that information, if we as a society don't know how to translate improved information into improved outcomes, then the information doesn't have a lot of use. So for instance, I think, when people are thinking about risk assessment, they took for granted this idea that locking up more high-risk individuals would lead to a decrease in crime. But if incarceration is criminogenic, meaning that the experience of incarceration increases your likelihood of committing crime, it could work the opposite direction. Locking up more high-risk individuals could lead to a net increase in crime if that's the effect that dominates. And I think I'm not ready to take a firm stance on this. I think the answer is unclear. This could partially explain the effect, but I think we need more research in this area. And then finally, I want to get to the area that I think is important, and this is the question of conflicting objectives. So let's talk through this a little bit more carefully. I'm going to start by showing some descriptive data about when judges deviate from the recommendations of the risk assessment. And maybe this will help us understand why risk assessment didn't bring the gains that its advocates hoped that it would. So here we're just regressing, an indicator for whether or not the defendant is diverted on a variety of different factors. And you can see that white defendants are more likely to be diverted, female defendants are more likely to be diverted, and young defendants are more likely to be diverted. They see, judges tend to be more lenient on those who evoke sympathy. Now, I think that age is something that deserves a little bit of extra attention. So young age is the most important predictor of reoffending. Every risk assessment tool has age in it. I once kind of reverse engineered the COMPAS algorithm. It's a proprietary algorithm. I found that you could explain literally 55% of the variation with solely of a risk assessment for violent recidivism solely on age. This is kind of like criminology 101. It's one thing we know for sure, most crime is committed by young people. But there's this tension. So if you're sentencing solely based on this idea of locking up those at highest risk of reoffending, you want to take teenagers and really lock them up and throw away the key until they turn 30. But that's not, that's not something I think most people would say yes, that's a great idea. People don't want to be harsh on young people. Yes, technically teenagers, people in their early 20s might be statistically at higher risk of reoffending, but they're also just a lot of them are just going through a phase. They have poor impulse control, their brains are still developing, they're susceptible to peer influences. There's a lot of kind of reasons why age could be considered a mitigating factor instead of an aggravating factor. Now, if age is one of the most important predictors or the most important inputs to a risk assessment, it basically handicaps the risk score. It's basically saying effectively in the way that we're going to use it, we're going to use it in a way that kind of pulls out one leg of the stool. It decreases its accuracy, it decreases its potential gain. Now, again, this is probably not a mistake. This is probably just competing goals. Judges, have other goals beyond incapacitating those at highest risk of reoffending, including, not being draconian on young men and women. I'd also suggest that prior studies may have overestimated the extent to which judges were making prediction errors. In fact, they might have just been following these other motives. So what happened? So here this is the triple differences design I talked about previously with comparing younger and older defendants as the third dimension of differencing. And here is showing the actual impact on the left, the actual impact that risk assessment had on relative sentencing for young people. And you can see that risk assessment did lead to an increase in sentences for the young. Over here on the right, this is a simulated impact. This is what, if judges had not used their discretion to deviate from the recommendations of the risk assessment, particularly for young people, to be lenient on young people that the risk assessment said was high risk, age disparities would have skyrocketed. So we do see some increase, but nowhere near as much as we would have seen if we had gone purely into sentencing by algorithm. And I think for many people, this is probably a good thing. Like, judges use their discretion to put the brakes on what was probably an unintended consequence of risk assessment adoption. I don't think most people are like, yes, let's adopt risk assessments that we can lock up all the teenagers and release the older people. I mean, that's one stance somebody could have, but I don't think this was a carefully explored and, kind of a consciously adopted choice, but rather an inadvertent impact that judges mitigated. All right, so basically at the end with this paper, to summarize some of the results. So when you get this man and machine together, this human adopting the algorithm, weird things can happen. So algorithmic social engineering, which is just a phrase I can use in a few different settings, but this is what I mean here is the legislature tried to accomplish a sentencing goal by adopting the algorithms. They tried to basically nudge judges towards being more lenient than they had previously. And that didn't work out. It didn't work out. It didn't result in that decrease of incarceration that people had hoped for, because judges used it in their own way. They used it kind of off-label. They didn't just increase releases for the low-risk people. They increased incarceration for the high-risk people, which led to this kind of net neutral. No evidence of quote efficiency gains or being able to reduce incarceration without increasing crime or vice versa. And that's at least partially explained by this idea of conflicting objectives, being unwilling to fully follow the risk assessment because some of the unintended consequences in terms of young people were not palatable to the judges making decisions. And finally, there was adverse impacts on sensitive groups. Certainly adverse impacts on the young, adverse impacts on people of color among the judges that used them most. And this just goes back to what I said previously. So there are disparities in the risk score, but just as important when considering its use in practice is how judges may follow or ignore them in disparate ways as well. All right, so that's kind of the conclusion of talking about this paper. I did say I wanted to take a few minutes at the end just to point you towards what I think are some promising directions for algorithms or for data science more broadly in the criminal legal system. And I'm going to point partly towards research that other people are doing. So one area that I think is interesting is the potential for democratization. So risk assessments do a lot. They do a lot. People mostly think of them as predictive tools, but one thing that they do is, to the extent that that they shift some amount of power from the judge and towards the people that design and build them. Now, in a system where judges have full discretion, one could argue there's not a lot of power shifted, but there are ways to make it costlier for judges to deviate. There's ways to make them more influential. Now, what this opens up the opportunity for is democratization. So if you put control of use and design of algorithms in the hands of communities most impacted, it's just one way of kind of shifting some of the decision-making power to particular groups of people. And there's great research by Ngozi Okedegbe on this area if you want to look at more. One challenge in this kind of approach is that algorithms need to be interpretable. In order to get people engaged in the process of being a stakeholder in this, they need to really understand what an algorithm is doing and what its implications are. So that's one area that might be interesting for people to research in. Another area that has promise is using algorithms to direct people towards resources instead of directing them towards increased incarceration. Again, there's multiple people doing research in this area, but Sandy Mason is one to look forward. So, the idea here is instead of locking up high-risk people, why don't you give them something that they need, something that would reduce their risk, something that could help mitigate the risk in a more supportive way, in a more kind of like non-punitive way than is currently being implemented. So one challenge here is combining prediction with causal inference. So, how can we predict who's going to benefit most from these resources? and what kind of resources are important. You know, it's one thing to say, you know, what your own, you know, in this way, one of the things you might want to do is an algorithm that's not just predicting someone's behavior in absence of the intervention, but predicting how much an intervention would change their behavior. And this is, I think, a fairly complicated task that there has not been a lot of work in yet, but could be really exciting and really beneficial. Another line of thought is turning the gaze around. So you could look at research by Vincent Sutherland, who talks about this. And this is instead of, you know, using an algorithm pointed at the defendants, pointing at the people that are kind of getting processed in the criminal legal system, using data or algorithms to identify bad practices and actors within the criminal legal system, and in order to affect meaningful change. You know, so there's a, you know, one area of challenge here is data access and availability. So in order to be able to do this, you really need to be able to have the data that's necessary to do so. Okay, just a couple more, and then I'm going to wrap up. Another way that I think is interesting is automating release. So you know, I've already talked a little bit about how algorithms can shift power from, you know, from a purely discretionary system, from the decision maker in a discretionary system towards the designer. And if, you know, if algorithms were used to you know, to kind of automate release, to really push in a heavy way towards decarceration, that is, you know, kind of one way that power can potentially be implemented. Alex Albright, who's a PhD student at Harvard right now, has got some really interesting research about this in Kentucky, where they use the risk assessment to automatically release without monetary bail low risk individuals charged with non-serious crimes. And so look at her research to look a little bit more about that. One challenge here, and honestly, this is a challenge in all of them, but this is the one I stuck here, is getting political buy-in. So a lot of the question is, you know, there's always some aspect of this puzzle that's technical, and then another big aspect which is human. You know, how do you get support for this? How do you move this forward? And then finally, and this is kind of, you know, adopting some of the goals and ideals of abolition, which is not just, you know, let's get rid of jails and prisons, but moreover, let's think of ways outside of the criminal legal system to address some of the same harms, to be able to prevent instead of punishing. And so there's a variety of ways that data science can be influential here. You know, one challenge would be identifying effective alternatives. So if we really are going to move as a society towards being one that addresses crime in a preventive way, in a manner that is not so rooted in punishing wrongdoers, we need to understand what that process looks like a little bit better. How can we come up with effective alternatives? How can we transform systems outside of the criminal legal system so that the criminal legal system becomes less necessary? So in sum, you know, risk assessment did not bring, I think, any real meaningful gains in Virginia. I have not seen research in a variety of jurisdictions. I've not seen any meaningful gains in other ones either. But there are lots of ways that data science can contribute to meaningful reform of the criminal legal system. I suggested a few that I found particularly interesting. Of course, there are many more out there, and many of great researchers doing work in this area. So thank you so much for the opportunity to talk, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Megan. Really, I think we all appreciate how textured, how detailed your work is, how thoughtful you're being in terms of asking questions around the role that analytics can play in such an important societal space. We have lots of questions. I'm going to though take the prerogative as chair to just ask you a few clarifying questions first, and then we'll go to some questions from the audience. I wonder if you could speak just a little bit to the way the risk assessment tool is actually used by a judge. I was wondering, for example, you know, do they do the calculation? I assume not. Do they see the breakdown of the individual feature scores? I assume yes. Like, what kind of training are they getting in regard to the tool?
So, okay, great questions. And these are important details. So let me start and say that I have been using kind of simplified language that's not totally accurate. So I've been saying the judge, when in truth, it's a bunch of criminal justice actors that are influential on the sentencing decision. Formally, judges are in charge of sentencing. That's supposed to be how it works. In practice, a lot of this happens in the process of plea negotiation. By the prosecutor can be very influential. The defense, counsel, obviously what the defendant agrees to is influential. But of course, this is all kind of in the shadow of the judge. The judge needs to approve any negotiation or any negotiated sentence that comes about. So the forms are filled out. There's a series of forms that are filled out during the sentencing process. They're filled out either by a probation officer or a prosecutor. Those forms are available during the plea negotiation process and are influential during the plea negotiation process as well, partly because the prosecutor is responding to them independently, partly because they expect that it might influence whether or not the judge will approve a negotiated sentence. So there's a variety of different actors here, but these sentences, the forms that have the risk assessment and other information are provided to the judge. They're available to the prosecutor during the negotiation process. They're provided to the judge at the sentencing moment. And the information that's most salient to them, or at least that I assume is most salient to them, is on the front page. And the front page doesn't give the exact risk score, doesn't give the inputs. It simply says, there's just a box right next to the guidelines recommended sentence. There's a box that says recommended for diversion. And if they score low enough, there's a check mark on that box. And if they don't, then there isn't. So that being said, I think there's reason to think that information might be particularly salient because it's right at the front. It's part of the recommended sentence, part of the recommendations. If the judge wants to, they can just flip a couple more pages into the packet and see the actual raw score, see the inputs to the raw score, and respond to those as well.
I see. And is there any feedback going to judges over time about the relationship between scores and what happens when people were released? Any feedback loop in Virginia?
Yeah, so I mean, there's basic, so the judges, if somebody's convicted, everyone's convicted in the sample, if they're released and they're still on some sort of probation, if they get picked up for a new crime, they come back to that same judge. So the judge there's informal feedback in that they see who comes back into their court, but there's not a kind of formal, this is how well, this is the fraction of recidivists who score at this level and so forth.
Very good. I want to go next to a question by DJ Ursel. I think where DJ is going with his question is he's speaking to the fundamental question as to what data do we feed into the model. He asks, aren't we creating a subjective bias in terms of the features we use for training the model, which results in the checklist? Or is there guidance for what judges should be paying attention to, i.e. are there best practices? So for example, I was somewhat surprised that age and gender are explicit inputs into the model. I was not surprised that race is not an explicit input. Presumably there's guidance from the justice system as to what one should pay attention to and what one should not pay attention to. Is that right? Or is that by far an oversimplification?
So I'll let you know, so that when I was looking at the documentation for risk assessment development in the 90s, they say, we discussed including race, but decided not to. So it was still a question, fairly recently. As race and gender, I don't think sometimes people dispute gender on constitutional grounds, but that does not usually, in practice, it's very commonly used. By and large, there hasn't been the same type of kind of intensive inquiry and debate into what goes into these risk assessment tools as there would have been for kind of a sentencing decision, like a sentencing policy. There was a sentencing law that said, we are going to increase sentences based on your age. I feel like that would be something that would raise a lot of eyebrows. They'd be like, are we really doing this? Why are we doing this? This doesn't, make sense. This doesn't, sit well with me. But the risk assessment tools are often developed kind of independently of the lawmaking process. They're not developed by legislatures. They're developed by, in this case, it's the Sentencing Commission, which, works closely with lawmakers, but there's just a lot of, there's statisticians, there's criminologists, and there's kind of, there's administrative people that are working on developing this. And there certainly are subjective decisions about what's allowed to go in and what isn't. There's subjective decisions about what you're training your model to predict. What's the thing that we should care about? Is it arrest for any crime? Is it arrest for serious crime? Is it conviction, actually? Is it conviction for a violent crime? And these are, these will all influence both the scores that people get, how the score is interpreted and used. And there hasn't been a lot of oversight or a lot of regulation or a lot of kind of thoughtful process that involves multiple stakeholders in having these conversations.
I want to get back to that, but I think this is actually a really good time to go to a question we have from Andrea, who's speaking to human factors. And I think the governance type of decisions that go into what data is used, what risk assessment tool is used. And she's speaking to New Jersey. She says that New Jersey enacted their own bail reform in 2017. I think she's implying that they introduced analytic tools. And she says the effect was to reduce the incarceration rate of the Black and brown population and increasing it for the white population. Then she says that executives realized they needed more information to understand the new tools, and that on the side, they created a second version, capturing more historical data and other information. She says that second tool did not reduce the incarceration rate of people of color and was not, I think she's implying it was not adopted. And the point she makes is that executives are following orders. They want to reduce bias, but they ended up doing it through using a tool that was built using specific data, not the entire data. And she also makes the point that IT leaders want to please the business executives. And the most of the time she heard, this is what they want. So I think it's kind of an interesting series of comments around the agency, the structure of the organization making decisions. Just wanted to invite you to comment on her remarks.
Yeah, those are great. I wish we were in person so I could speak with you more after this, because there's a lot going on there, and it sounds like Andrea knows more about some of this than I do. So let me just pick up a few pieces on there. So first, the question of racial disparities. So people talk a lot about disparities, like the Black incarceration versus the white incarceration rate. And that's important. That's important. Don't get me wrong, that's important. But there's also a level question. If you lower incarceration rate for everybody at the same rate, you're not affecting racial disparities, but you're decreasing, you're releasing a lot of people, and a lot of those people are Black and brown people. So, in this particular instance, she said it was kind of maybe even elevated, even more for Black and brown people than for white people. That's not always the case. Sometimes it kind of goes down equally for everybody, but that doesn't mean that it's not a kind of, didn't kind of result in what is in my mind, real improvements. The second piece I wanted to say was, about the role of risk assessment in the decline, in the original decline in 2017. So I don't know how big a role risk assessment played in reducing jail rates. This is in pretrial detention in New Jersey. So there's two other important things here. One is that they effectively got rid of money bail. So that's an important thing. And the second thing is that they made it procedurally a real expensive hassle to incarcerate somebody. You needed to have basically like a whole mini trial with evidence, with defense counsel present, in order to, with the burden of proof on the prosecution, in order to demonstrate that somebody was a high enough risk they needed to be locked up. Now, just like that takes up time and resources. And anything that takes up time and resources, I'm an economist, remember, I'm like, it takes up time and resources, people are going to consume less of it. They're gonna be less willing to go through this very expensive, time-consuming process because they just can't afford to do that for everybody. Before that, what New Jersey did, which is true in, it's still going on in most parts of the world, a bail hearing literally takes like 30 seconds to a minute, where the judge reads out the charges, says your bail is this amount. Do you have any questions? The answer is no, sir. That is the end of it. There's your bail amount. If you can afford it, you go home. If you can't, you stay in jail. So I think these two things were greatly contributed a lot to the decline in jail populations in New Jersey. And this decline began even before risk assessment was adopted. Began quite substantially even before risk assessment was adopted. The last thing that I want to say is that the tool risk that New Jersey adopted was developed by the Arnold Foundation. And so the Arnold Foundation is a kind of a nonprofit, philanthropic group who has been extraordinarily, like, a very big player in this conversation. They built this risk assessment tool and then provided resources and encouragement for jurisdictions to adopt it. It's since become very widely used, almost, I think, 100 jurisdictions across the United States, including multiple entire states have since adopted it. And so I just want to introduce them as a third player in the room where, there's, I believe Arnold Foundation has got the, I believe their heart's in the right place. They're trying to do good things, but it's effectively a fair amount of power, a fair amount of influence in developing this tool and, kind of helping guide how it's implemented. That's kind of, nobody said like, let's this guy's got a bunch of money, he started a philanthropical foundation. They are clearly the ones who should be in charge of figuring this out for us. I'm not saying they're not doing, have the right heart in the right place or whatever, but ideally, I think you want this to be more of a, to the extent that people's freedom is on the line, you want this to be more of a deliberative process, more of a democratic process, something, where people who are particularly impacted really have a voice.
Yeah, and I really like the point you made about the democratization that can come from tools being available to be looked at and used and experimented with by anybody, essentially. Let me go to a question from Froka Kreuter. She asks, do you have any insights on the quality of the data that is used to create the risk assessment scores?
Oh gosh, that is a great question. So I think you could look at it in two different ways. And one way I've already kind of discussed. So to the extent that the criminal record is supposed to be a proxy for actual crimes committed and severity of those crimes, I think the data is very bad. I think the data is very bad. I think it is not it's very bad, and it's a biased proxy of actual criminal activity. To the extent that, are we even capturing, if it says that, if the data says that somebody has 3 arrests, are we sure they actually had 3 arrests, or could it be possible that their name got conflated with somebody else when they did the criminal record search? I think that's a concern. I don't know how big of a concern it is. I think that type of question is hard to answer, but I do think it's something that is, I would love for people to do some more research on this and be able to really provide some solid numbers for how much that type of error is occurring.
Thanks. We have 2 questions from Richard Bourne. I think we'll take his questions one at a time. So the first question is, he's curious whether judges and juries use base rates in evaluating evidence that is presented at trial. Do you have any insight into this? Or go ahead.
So this is, but first of all, just to clarify, this risk assessment is after a trial. So everyone is convicted here. Risk assessments and statistical evidence is generally not allowed in when the question is this person guilty? Should they be convicted? There's actually a fairly bright line, like you are not allowed to bring in statistical evidence to suggest someone's guilt.
Right.
In the trial phase. Once somebody has been convicted, the door is wide open, bring in whatever you want. That's kind of how the law currently works. As far as base rates, I should have mentioned this previously because this is actually important. the risk assessment information that's provided by the judges, it's just an ordinal number. Like, this person is a 7, this other person is a 4. 4 is more risk than 7, but they don't provide any information about what the recidivism rates of a 7 are, or the recidivism rates of a 4 are. And research suggests that people tend to overthink that these are higher than they are. Recidivism rates tend to be fairly low, particularly for serious violent crimes. We're talking like a couple percentage points kind of at most for most people. And so even though, you know, sometimes you have this label of high risk, when you look at the actual likelihood of being arrested or convicted of a new crime, it's pretty darn low. And so some people argue that these tools would be more effective if, instead of just giving this kind of, you know, this kind of meaningless information about ranking, you gave actual statistical numbers about what somebody's predicted likelihood of conviction is within a certain time frame.
And then his second question is whether the socioeconomic status features that go into the risk assessment model can be used to predict the race of the defendant. I wonder if you've been able to look at that. And I suppose I would have a follow-on question to that question, which is, can the features together with the risk assessment score be used to predict race?
Yeah, they can. I mean, they're all correlated with race. I have actually looked into this, and I can't remember how accurate the classification was. Obviously, there's a bunch of people that it gets wrong, but it's certainly, you know, in that all of these things are correlated with race. You can make predictions with a reasonable degree of accuracy about what race somebody is.
Yeah.
Which brings to mind, you know, there's sort of this. I think there's some really great research by Isa Kohler-Hausman and Lily, I've forgotten her last name, but you know, they argue that kind of these constructs of race shouldn't be thought of as something that exists separately from all of these other factors. You know, so to the extent that you can kind of predict race with a reasonable degree of accuracy with the factors that you have in there, there's really, like, it is literally having race in your data, even if you don't have a column that has the header race and says white, black, or whatever. You know, to the extent that race is socially constructive, that it's constitutive of these kind of relationships with socioeconomic markers and the criminal record, and all of that stuff is constitutive of what the socially constructed category of race is, then race is literally in there, one could argue.
I mean, I'm going to take my prerogative now and kind of step back and ask some more general questions. So first question I have is, given that these types of algorithmic tools are likely to be biased, how much diligence should society expect in regard to them before they are deployed? And can that even be done, given that, as you said, this is often a causal inference problem? The simple way to ask my question is, how do we decide when a tool is good enough to deploy? Maybe very concretely, how did Virginia decide to use this tool?
Yeah. So let me start with the second question, which is, I think that one way of looking at it is its use going to exacerbate disadvantage and disparities and bias and problems, or is it going to mitigate it? So if you have a racially biased tool and the tool is used to give supportive resources to people, that's using the tool in a way that yes, it might be racially biased, but that its effect is likely to mitigate biases, to reduce these things, to reduce the problem. So that's the sort of, you know, the thing I pointed out in the end. Like, if you use the risk assessment tool to direct resources towards people instead of directing kind of who gets put in the concrete cage, then a lot of the issues and concerns that were raised around racial bias are dramatically reduced, or, you know, just kind of get into a whole new framework there. And I think to a certain extent, this principle, this principle can be extended a little bit. So if you're using a risk assessment tool to automate release in the same way that I talked about happened in Kentucky, and there's research from Alex Albright about this. You're expecting the net effect to be overall, when you look at its impact on people of color, it's giving something beneficial to them. I would say for me, I'm a little less concerned about racial biases if it's being used in this way. I'm not saying that I'm not concerned about it, but like I might be, the net effects of the adoption, feel preferable. Your first question, which I might not be totally remembering.
Question was how much diligence should society expect before we deploy a tool, and can that even be done given that we have missing counterfactuals? Do you have any thoughts about this?
Yeah, so there's a lot of talk about debiasing algorithms. I don't know that I'm hugely optimistic right now about this as a direction of research. And I could say for a few reasons why. So one of the reasons is just practical. Like I feel like our risk, I feel like right now I don't see an algorithm that has been, I think the debiasing process is likely to be very contested because, I don't know, to the extent that if your goal is to say, well, we're taking points off of their criminal record because of their race, because we think it overrepresents the number of crimes they've committed. Now that's an argument that I've made. That's an argument I can get behind, but I don't know how many points to take off. And I just don't see that flying right now, like in our current system. But moreover, I think I'm also just not like the type of change that I want to see is much more fundamental and much more transformative than like, let's simply figure out a better way to predict who's going to commit crime in the future. So that's just like the task of, well, we'll just debias the algorithm and then we'll keep doing the same things that we have been doing, incarcerating people on the basis of speculative future offenses. And moreover, with a very low bar for how high their risk needs to be in order to warrant incarceration. In practice, judges seem to behave as if any risk of committing, crime is sufficient to take away someone's freedom. And I think that's wrong. I think that if you're going to take someone's freedom away on the basis of speculations of what they might do in the future, you need to be really confident that they're going to do something really bad in order to justify that. So for my own, my own personal take on where I think the criminal legal system is and where I want it to go, I think debiasing the algorithms is both like not hugely practical, not to have likely immediate effect, and also not kind of vision, not keeping the eye on the prize, like the sort of more transformative change.
Yeah, I'm hearing loud and clear your call to arms for analytics more broadly. Think about the role of resources. Think about trying to understand when is incarceration effective versus not effective, etc. Not just looking at that one crucial decision, but looking at all of the surrounding decisions as well. We have a lot more questions, but we only have 1 or 2 minutes left. So I'm just going to ask the following question because I'm curious and I don't want to. I'm just curious if you have a view on this. Do you have a view on what the general sentiment is within the judiciary at the moment in regard to the role of algorithmic tools, let's say in the near term or the longer term? And I know that you can't speak for the judiciary, but I'm curious if you have a view into this.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think the general view is that it's kind of like, meh, sure, why not? Like, I could see it kind of being useful, but I'm not really going to pay a ton of attention to it. I'm not going to delegate a ton of authority to it, but more information is better. I think a lot of people kind of come from that background. I think to the extent that judges are a little bit more progressive or are representing more progressive districts, there is more and more concern about the racial bias issue. And I think there's a lot of that translates just into a little bit like of a hands-off feeling and a skepticism. yeah, I think that's the best way I can say it.
Megan, thank you. I hope that those of you in the audience will have been inspired to not only read Megan's papers, read the work of the other scholars that she's referenced, and consider spending your data analytics resources and research on these types of questions. I think there's a lot that we can do here, and I believe that it's an area where we can both be using analytics to understand where bad decisions are being made, but also try to improve those decisions as well. Megan, thank you. For everybody else in the audience, just a note about our next event. That will be a panel on personalized health. It will take place at noon on November the 16th. It will be moderated by Zach Cohen and John Quackenbush, my colleagues here at Harvard, and it will feature Priti Hegde, Mark Nemchuk, and Jessica Tenenbaum. With that, we're over and out. Megan, again, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye.